Great. Thank you. That was a great session. First session. Thank you, Dr. Jacob. Was excellent. I somehow find I can't disagree with him on anything, because actually the strength of a webinar should be when there are two speakers who disagree with each other completely. I don't seem to be thinking I can disagree on anything which he has spoken about. But I will speak a few things which are a little different perhaps. And I won't exceed my time. I'll try and make sure that I don't spend more than 15 minutes or 17 minutes maximum. Let me start with the background. What is the Taliban? I mean, in India, most people are not aware of who are the Taliban or what are the Taliban, right? I take you back to the iconic year of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century, 1979. That if a person in a student of international relations does not know 1979 and has not analyzed it backwards, he has not done his job. 79, three major events: Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution, and the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by the Ikhwan, right? A surge in Islamist movements, an attempt to try and get into Afghanistan to counter the Soviets, defeat them, transnational mercenaries, 3 million refugees coming into Pakistan all along the western border, the Afghan-Pakistan border, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa into Baluchistan. Saudi-supported madrasas came up all along. The first time you heard the term madrasa actually saying. Otherwise in India, madrasas have existed. No one really bothered to look at them in that manner. But suddenly the importance of the madrasa, the seminary, suddenly came up. And you found, I love to link this up. The Pakistan establishment and the deep state was looking for opportunities and ways. They knew that they cannot take revenge against India on the battlefield. Militarily defeating India was virtually impossible. Economically contesting India was impossible. The one way which Pakistan can really bring India to its knees is through the system which is called hybridity, hybrid conflict, mixture of different things. And one of the major contributions could be ideology. And someone sensed it very correctly when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan came in, and the Americans and the Saudis got together and sponsored the Pakistani surge into Afghanistan to get rid of the Soviets. The war was fought by mercenaries from all over the Islamic world, but the leadership and the intelligence was all provided by Pakistan. Tremendous experience was gained. In those seminaries there on the western border, the Taliban was born. And they realized that this element is what can be the greatest weapon that Pakistan can have for the future. Not realizing that at some stage, people can be under your control up to a point. Beyond that, no, you can't just control human beings in that manner. Pakistan thought that they could control everything in Afghanistan. They always considered Afghanistan as their backyard, virtually. They thought that that Afghanistan is actually the strategic depth. They got to start believing themselves that this is the strategic depth, right? And therefore, they trained up these young people in these camps, ideologically linked them to the more obscurantist kind of ideologies coming out from Saudi Arabia, because of the interest of Saudi Arabia. And you see how things have changed today. Saudi Arabia is not even being mentioned today. Everyone is mentioning Iran. Everyone is mentioning China. No one is mentioning Saudi Arabia or UAE. The two countries, along with Pakistan, which recognized the Taliban in the beginning. Just keep this in mind. And then 15 years later, from 1981 to 1996, the Taliban came to power, right? And they brought in that very obscurantist ideology into governance, their whole concept of gender inequality and things like that, which put the whole world against them. And then, of course, becoming the hosts for Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda in 2001, you know finally what happened. That has been the broad. What people generally miss out is that the Taliban is the creation of Pakistan. It was created for a purpose. Pakistan's quest to be the flag bearer of Islam, to be the #1 country, will never die down. It doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the capability, but it's got one very important aspect. it's got this geostrategic location. A geostrategic location, if you describe Pakistan the way I describe Pakistan, is a nation surrounded by 5 civilizations: Indian, Chinese, Central Asian, Persian, and Arab. No country in the world has got 5 civilizations around it. And it can influence all of them and take their influence in also. That's the classic thing about Pakistan. It's a nation which needs to be studied so deeply. No one really has understood the complexities of that nation. So Taliban was definitely a creation of Pakistan. Whether the Taliban will come back to remain a creation of Pakistan and continue to cooperate with them is something which Dr. Ibrahim Jacob described very well. There's no guarantee to that at all. But one of the purposes definitely that the Pakistanis had of creating the Taliban was to ensure Afghanistan was under their control, and that this region generally veered towards an Islamist ideology. Kashmir would change, Jammu and Kashmir, the Islam of Jammu and Kashmir would change, and you would find the Jammu and Kashmir in a link with Pakistan, Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia. That is how the linkage would take place, and that is how it would help Pakistan to fight the proxy war in Jammu and Kashmir. A lot of people blame me and say, sir, you're obsessed. You're obsessed with Pakistan's game plan in Kashmir. But let me tell you, this is actually the truth, right? The way I believe it. Now, when the US went in 2001, why didn't they succeed? In last 20 years, what was the reason why they did not succeed? Of course, besides the reason that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, the people of Afghanistan have resisted historically in this manner. Besides all those factors, the fact is that the United States really didn't know how to fight this war. They fought the war almost conventionally. Number two, they didn't understand the culture of Afghanistan. You can't start fighting these kind of wars. These are not classically conventional wars. These are hybrid wars in which you have to fight the hybrid way. It took them 10, 12 years to start understanding the basic culture of Afghanistan, right? And then they thought that they could bring in an American liberal democracy in Afghanistan. I mean, how ridiculous can you get? How can you introduce liberal democracy in Afghanistan? Right? Afghanistan it's got a culture of its own, is a proud people. They know how exactly to govern themselves. You can't start dictating things to them, right? So with all this, the Americans could not succeed. The Americans could have tried something. They could have doubled, tripled the deployment of forces. Their strength was 140,000 at the maximum which it went up. They could have brought in 400,000 troops. They could have started conscription like they did in Vietnam. But remember, in Vietnam, they lost 58,000 soldiers. Here, they lost 2,400 soldiers. Only 2,400 comparison in 20 years. In Vietnam, in 15 years, they lost 58,000 soldiers, along with conscription at that time. So, body bags going home, it was not acceptable to the Americans. And they came in essentially to seek a revenge for what happened for 9/11. The aims and intentions kept changing from time to time, and when you keep changing your aims and intentions in that manner, obviously you are not going to succeed in your larger mission. So that is the broad story of the American story there. Now, is the Taliban strong enough? First of all, let me tell you, I am of the strong belief today that this situation which is presenting itself will probably pan out for fairly long. One thing is clear. Is not going to be under the control of a single entity for quite some time. We invested a lot in the government of national unity. Very good thing. The American presence, the presence of the government of national unity was all for favor of India, strategically in favor of India, because that side was committed. The Pakistanis were also committed to that side, right? And we were comparatively, in a more stable environment. But the sudden move of the Americans has upset the whole apple cart at the moment. And the fact that we did not invest enough in other parties, which is what Dr. Jacob was very correctly saying, that over a period of time, you have to start realizing where does the future lie. And therefore, you have to start assessing 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, what are the potentialities? And your policy making has to be based on that. You can't put your eggs into one basket. What we have done, unfortunately, is that we have put our eggs into one basket completely. We've done a damn good job. We've done a damn good job training Afghan people, training the Afghan National Army, inviting them to our academies and doing this, spending $3 billion of soft power. But at the end of the day, you're seeing that the one pragmatic thing which would have given you greater dividends would have been the sense of balance. Our ability to make an outreach to the Taliban also. If not overtly, at least covertly, if nothing else. Nations do that all the time. They have their fingers in different pies. And therefore, I, for one, totally support what Dr. Habib Jacob said, that even now it is not too late. It is not too late. And what Nazir was saying very correctly, that you have to reach out. You have to reach out to different segments and ensure that their interests, your interests, the commonality of interest are somehow matched. And it happens over a period of time. You can achieve that. Now, whether the ANA can weather this whole storm, can it defeat the Taliban? Now, this is a very interesting aspect from a military point of view. And that I'll spend 2 minutes to describe it to you. India has invested a fair amount in the Afghan National Army, which is about 350,000 strong, in keeping the Afghan National Police in mind also. They've got good weaponry. If you see the weapons of the Afghan armed forces, you will find actually they've got far better weapons than the Indian Army. Right? They've got state-of-the-art things. A lot of people don't realize that they also have an air force. They've got 160 aircraft in their air force even today. Many of them are old aircraft. Some of them are helicopters only, fixed wing, a few of them. The problem is pilots. And the Taliban has been targeting the pilots. That's the unfortunate thing. So the pilots are much lesser. Ammunition is a bit of a problem. To make up for that, the Americans can fly missions if they want, right from their deployment in the Indian Ocean. Today's modern aircraft have the capability to fly from anywhere to anywhere. They can do that because the Americans have not been successful in getting airfield or air bases in Pakistan, and they couldn't have got it in Iran. I'm not sure whether there's something happening in Uzbekistan. Maybe something they may have got in Uzbekistan, for all you know. I'm not very certain about it, but Uzbekistan is one of those countries which is cooperating tremendously with them at this time. Tajikistan, no. The Tajiks are much more aligned to the Russians. You have the 202 or 201 motorized division of the Russian army, which is located in Tajikistan itself. Tajikistan is a place where we have got an air base. We have got an air base there, and we have a small establishment of the Air Force also in that place. Now, with all this, the Afghan National Army also has got a fair amount of support weapons. I don't think there's a dearth of ammunition. They've got a fair amount of support weapons. The mainstay of the Afghan National Army is a 40,000 strong special forces group. Very well trained by the Americans, very well equipped. Now, they are the people who are the mainstay today. You saw what happened about 3 weeks ago when the Taliban captured those 22 of these special forces personnel. They were all killed in cold blood, right? And it was to send home a message. It was actually to psych the Afghan National Army and their personnel. You have to remember one more thing. This is an army, the Afghan National Army is an army which has been taking on an average 8,000 fatal casualties every year for the last 3 years. You haven't heard of this anywhere in the world. 8,000 fatalities in a year means 600 fatalities in a month. Can you imagine? If you start getting inputs that the Indian army is losing 600 soldiers in Kashmir, you will be shocked absolutely. That's the kind of ferocity with which operations have been going on in Afghanistan during the spring offensive and things like that. So my final thing on this military aspect. 4 weeks ago, we heard the Taliban has captured 80%, 85%, and that these people have been vanquished completely, and the victory is on the cards. Why was all this information coming to you? Remember one thing. Much of this information was coming from the ISPR of Pakistan, Inter-Services Public Relations, who are masters at information warfare. right? They were putting out fake news, false news all the time to you, right? Today also, there are areas in Afghanistan which can be with the Taliban in the morning and it can be with the ANA in the evening. It is that kind of a tenuous situation that you have, right? As long as this battle was in the rural areas, there the typical guerrilla hard-hitting tactics can work. IEDs placement on the roads and tracks can work, right? But the moment this battle is enjoined into the cities, the moment you are having a battle for Kabul or you're having a battle for Herat, right? Then the whole modality is changed. You will find that a well-established conventional army like the ANA will outperform the Taliban. And it's going to happen that way. It's going to happen that way. You are seeing the manner in which the ANA is fighting. But I'm not saying that there's going to be victory for anyone. The ANA is not going to win this. The Taliban is not going to win this. This is what we should be picturing in your mind is this going to be a Syria-like situation? Is this going to be a new Syria? You've seen the pictures of Syria, the kind of ravaging of the cities which has taken place. The movement of displaced people. You had thousands of people moving out from Syria, moving into Europe. The amount of problems which were created in Europe in 2016-17, if you remember. ISIS mixed with these refugees, moving into Europe, creating problems there. Now, that's the kind of problem which can happen from Afghanistan. Maybe not inside Afghanistan. You'll have an outflow from there going into Pakistan. Maybe some outflow from there going into Iran. Iran, much less, but much more into Pakistan. Mixed with that, the possibility of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which has also been generally been pushed back into Afghanistan, also coming back into Pakistan. So what Dr. Jacob was saying was absolutely right. You are going to find a very tenuous internal security situation in Pakistan. So both Afghanistan and Pakistan are going to be in the throes of internal sometime. Not a very happy situation for us, let me tell you. For those who think that chaos in Pakistan is good for you, let me tell you, well, up to a point is good, but beyond that, chaos also ultimately manifests in its effects internally into India also. So I'll stop on the military side here. One or two other things which I will just want to highlight. This whole aspect of should we reach out to the Taliban or not. I've already mentioned it that we need to be there. We need to be a stakeholder. We are not getting sufficient importance on the sitting on the high table there, primarily because Pakistan has been ensuring that India does not. The moment we are seen to be in engagement with the Taliban, automatically India's stakes will rise and become higher. And that is why a lot of people who are using the black and white kind of argument to say you can't engage with people who are killers of women or who differentiate in genders and things like that. You can't. We can't. We are in Indians are very different to it. I would humbly beg forgiveness on this issue. It is national interest we are looking at. We are not looking at all kinds of semantics in terms of what is right and what is wrong here. When it comes to national interest, there are ways that the diplomacy works. Diplomacy always has to work in such situations differently, right? And there is no diplomacy if you just shut ourselves up into a black and white syndrome. Then there's no diplomacy, right? What is the need of diplomats? We'll just go along with whatever the government of national unity is doing. Lastly, there was a lot of things about the geopolitics around this. One of the things which I must address is, a lot of people ask me this question, what is the likely effect on Jammu and Kashmir? And I must admit to you, the area of this whole region is going to go into the throes of a fair amount of instability. The issue of terror, which has in the last 2 years taken a backseat, may once come to the forefront. Remember the ISIS, after its defeat in Syria, in Iraq, has gravitated towards North Afghanistan, is looking to get into Central Asia, right? Uh, that region, the new great game region, coming into the throes of instability is not good, because that will create problems in the entire region. Inspirationally, as Dr. Jacob was very correctly saying, inspirationally, it will send home a message to some of the youth in Jammu and Kashmir. Because remember, the networks in Jammu and Kashmir are still not completely neutralized. The sentiments in Jammu and Kashmir are still not completely overturned. A lot of people are thinking that 2 years down the line, after 5th of August decisions, every single person in Kashmir is now pro-India and saying Jai Hind. I'm sorry, I beg to differ with you. I'm seeing a lot of national flags coming up. Today also I found the GOC from Baramulla, my old division, rang me up to tell me that the biggest flag in Kashmir is coming up in Gulmarg. And they're going to put it on the hilltops on top and going to be fluttering from there. There's that Turkish tradition of putting massive flags like that. I tried it in Baramulla in way back. But I couldn't succeed in doing it that time, because I was always afraid that someone may try and burn that flag one fine day, right? But now the situation is definitely under control, far, far better today. But I don't think also at the same time that you can compare the situation to 1989, when you found that when the the international mercenaries, when they became unemployed, that they were all switched by the ISI from Afghanistan into Jammu and Kashmir. And for 5 years, 1991 to 1996, this pipeline remained and the fight carried on. That situation doesn't exist today. You have 63 battalions of the Rashtra Rifles there today. You have a very strong counter-infiltration grade. The LOC is quiet at the moment. The Pakistanis also want to keep it quiet. The hinterland networks are reasonably well under control, right? Except for the sentiments which are still there, I don't think there can be a surge in militancy or terror in Kashmir based upon events which are happening in Afghanistan. So I think I've spoken a lot for the last 15-20 minutes almost. I've covered just 3 or 4 areas, but I think I'll stop here and take questions, because that may generate more interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for those insightful remarks. I think I shouldn't be wasting enough time, and I'll let the audience ask questions. I think Rahul has a question. Please, Rahul, would you ask your question, followed by Gaurav? Sir, can we club 2 questions together?
Go ahead, absolutely.
Okay, sir. So, Rahul, please ask your question, and then we can have Gaurav's question.
I'm not hearing anyone.
Okay, Gaurav, please ask your question.
Sir, thank you, sir. Sir, I want to ask that has the United States extricated from Afghanistan in order to focus more on its pivot to the Indo-Pacific and its strategic competition with China?
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Well, there is a variety of reasons why the Americans have withdrawn. I don't think the Americans ever had their heart in Afghanistan. After having defeated the Taliban, and particularly after the death or killing of Osama bin Laden, the Americans were very, very reluctant. Under Obama, they had convinced him to agree to a military surge, which took place in 2009 and carried on until 2012-13. But thereafter, the Americans found different ways of making sure that they reduced their presence. Their presence was just about ultimately left to just about 5,000 troops. One thing about your presumption that they consider the rise of China as not a very peaceful rise. It just coincidentally, for those who are students of international relations, remember, it is the Americans who brought the Chinese back into the international system in 1969. right? None of you were born. I was very much here, a student in Delhi University. When Nixon came to India, from here he went to Islamabad, and from Islamabad, Henry Kissinger went to Beijing, and ping-pong diplomacy started. That was the beginning of the US-China bonhomie to bring the Chinese in, to bring China into the international system, become a member of the United Nations, give it a seat in the Security Council, and ensure that a level of cooperation was achieved which would help them in defeating the Soviet Union. They didn't want the Chinese in sync with the Soviet Union. Now the situation is very different. Once again, the Chinese and the Russians are coming together. The Chinese are, well, looking at expansion. They have from 2049, they have brought down their date to 2035 virtually, in which they want to be the superpower of the world, the number one nation of the world, defeat any other military of the world, technologically be the most superior nation. That will be 14 years from now. That is the time when Xi Jinping will be about 82 years old. That's the age of Mao Zedong, the age which Mao died at. Okay, so keeping all this in mind, then the Americans realize that the time is running out, and they have been committed to Afghanistan, Iraq, their interest in the Middle East. Geostrategically, the Middle East is very important. But ever since the discovery of shale gas and their dependence on energy having reduced, they are no longer looking at it with that strategic eye any longer as far as the Middle East is concerned. The Indo-Pacific opened up in 2016-17, Trump's time, when suddenly they brought in the term Indo-Pacific, and they started kowtowing with India to make sure that India becomes a very important player as far as the IOR, the Indian Ocean region, is concerned, and Australia, Japan, and the United States itself, potential partners like France, Vietnam, UK, etc. Lots of countries looking at the Pacific. You are seeing, even as we are talking today, there's a British aircraft carrier which is sailing through the South China Sea at the moment, showing the flag. We don't know what's going to happen. The Chinese are threatening and threatening and threatening. They haven't done anything so far, right? So it is important for the Americans to shift focus. I would say the best term for it is shift the center of gravity. The Chinese are going to make sure that they make every effort to prevent the Americans from shifting the center of gravity. Right? One of the reasons why this Ladakh crisis has taken place is a contributory factor to that. Someday we can discuss Ladakh. That is a contributory factor to this also. The fact that the Chinese are now looking at the aggregation of the Afghan, Central Asian region with Pakistan, Central Asia, Afghanistan and China is all in the interest of China to keep this region under its influence, right? It will help in the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. It will help in the whole Chinese ambitions of being a superpower, and it will hopefully help in preventing the Americans from actually moving their focus away from here. So you are absolutely right. This is one of the very important aspects the Americans are looking at, and they're looking at India. This whole visit of Secretary of State Blinken was one of the things was based on this. Of course, Afghanistan was an important aspect in it, but the main factor ultimately remains the Quad and remains the overall cooperation for the Indo-Pacific region. Yeah.
So next we have Akhilesh in the line.
Good evening, sir. Sir,
Good evening.
I want your views on that the Ladakh standoff and the Afghanistan program can give a rise to the Chinese annexation to the Taiwan, sir.
No, I'm not sure I've got your question right. You want me to explain to you the linkage between what's happened in terms of the Ladakh standoff with the situation in Afghanistan. How exactly are you linking the two?
Sir, I want to say that the Chinese is creating a havoc in the Central Asia, and they are busy in India for the Ladakh standoff, and they are trying to annex the Taiwan in next few years by creating these problems.
Okay. Remember, Akhilesh, that the Chinese are not going to do anything in black and white. It's not annexing something, capturing something. The world of international relations runs on what is called influence. They will attempt to influence everything. They've got tremendous influence in Central Asia, right? A lot of energy from Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, from Russia itself flows into China, right? They have helped Tajikistan develop its hydroelectric power, the complete potential in Tajikistan itself. Of course, you know the relationship with Pakistan. With Afghanistan, the Chinese have already bought a lot of their stakes in those rare earth fields, in the fields of minerals which are there, which they have not developed for the last 14, 15 years, which you will probably see them developing all that in the near future. But to link this now with Ladakh, the standoff in Ladakh was, to my mind, for a couple of reasons. A lot of people don't agree with me, but I always hold this reason, this argument. The Chinese were inherently worried that in the last 5 or 6 years, the rising tide of India's strategic confidence was causing worries to everyone. You see, till now, India was considered a benign state, strategically indecisive, cannot even look after its internal security issues. I mean, that was the kind of perceptions which were created. Suddenly, out of the blue, one event, if you see after 2016, it added to the image. 2016, the surgical strikes, right? A lot of hype created on the surgical strikes, good information built up on it. Thereafter, 2017, the Doklam standoff of 72 days. The Chinese stood down for other reasons. They stood down because the BRICS summit was coming up, because the 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party was coming up. But the perception created in the world was that the Indians have stared down the Chinese. The Chinese were not too happy with that, right? Although immediately after that, Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi agreed to have that exchanges. Prime Minister Modi went to Wuhan, Xi Jinping came to, what was that? Mahabalipuram, and all that exchange took place at that time. Right? 18 times the Prime Minister Modi met him, and we had a good relationship going. But while this relationship was supposedly very good, the Chinese were equally getting worried. Because there was 2017, if you see the standoff, 2018 and 17 and 18, if you see the situation in Jammu, largely Operation All Out has been successful. We had killed almost 500 terrorists in 17, 18. And 19, you had Pulwama. And the response to that was Balakot, right? Then you had the decision of 5th of August, where we openly published the maps showing the whole of Ladakh, Gilgit-Baltistan, and Aksai Chin as part of India, showing the golden portion, POK and Kashmir as part of India, which is very much as per the resolution of 1994, right? So all this created an impression, to my mind, a perception in the minds of the Chinese that if you allow this process to continue, India's aspirations are rising every day, and its capability of undertaking, being more offensive in its strategic outlook may one day lead to a major problem for China. And therefore, it was important to cow down India, right? To impose a caution on India, right? Upset its balance in terms of the deployment of its forces on the northern and the western borders. The intention was never to fight a war. You don't come with 50,000 troops in Ladakh to fight a war. 50,000 troops के साथ तो एक brigade लड़ेगा हमारा. And the only area they will capture is a small segment of the across the LAC. The Chinese can't afford to do that. If they are going to fight a war, they must win that war. I mean, the rest of the world will laugh at the superpower. You were talking about being a superpower. The Chinese can't risk this. They can't risk this to fight against India. Remember what happened in Nathula? Remember what happened in Sundarangchu? Right? So, this is the reason why this Ladakh standoff has taken place. Its connectivity to Afghanistan is almost zero. This nil. Right? But now the connectivity is to an extent has increased. In the sense, you just seen the 12th round talks which have taken place. Nothing has come out of it, and nothing will come out in the 13th, 14th, 15th round either, because the Chinese will keep you guessing, will keep you engaged, and that situation will remain tenuous. They will continue to keep your attention on the Himalayas. The Chinese intention is to keep your attention on the Himalayan belt, so that you as India will not focus enough on China's greatest weakness, and that is the maritime zone. The sea routes of communication, sea lines of communication which come from Suez Canal to the Straits of Malacca, going right next to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. This is the vulnerability of China, and this is what China is afraid about India. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think we have had a lot of questions due to the positive.
We can have one more question. We can have 1 to 2 questions more, doesn't matter.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, this is Kaushal Raj. Okay.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah. Go ahead. Kaushal, you muted yourself, I think. Anyone else was asking otherwise? Kelvin Benny has raised his hand.
Sir, good afternoon. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
I have about. Sir, as far I know, the money from the drugs and Golden Crescent is one of the things which prop up Taliban. And now it have even infiltrated our Punjab and destroying it, partially. So my doubt is that if India take a global initiative to fight the drug, then we can we bleed Taliban, or can we regulate its power? What's your opinion?
Good question. Connected, why this is a good question? There's no doubt about it. I was also to speak on this, because one of the questions which a lot of people ask me is, where does the Taliban get its money from? How does the Taliban run its resistance? How is the Taliban buying its weaponry? Well, much of this comes from the drug traffic, the Central Asian drug traffic, the Afghan drug traffic, clandestine routes of the Golden Crescent, as you very, very correctly have identified. One of the reasons why ISIS gravitated to northern Afghanistan was simply this: money. Because ISIS, you remember, ISIS survived for 4 years in Iraq and Syria because they looted the Mosul refinery, the Mosul treasury, $500 million worth. And they had the Mosul refinery with them, from which they sold oil to the same people who they were fighting with. Right? They sold oil to Israel, they sold oil to the Syrians, they sold oil to the Jordanians. This is the world of warfare. You sell something to the same person with whom you are fighting. Right? So the ISIS, after they got vanquished from that area, were looking for different sanctuaries. They looked at Philippines, they looked at India, Bangladesh. They couldn't really look at all these. They couldn't find anything out here. Although Sri Lanka, they did strike in Sri Lanka, but they have created something. They did attempt to create something in northern Afghanistan, where they had hoped that they would get cooperation. But then they came into confrontation with the Taliban. They are in confrontation with other terrorist organizations, etc. there. So it's a bugger's model which is going on there, all financed primarily by the drug circuits. You're right, absolutely. But I want you to appreciate one thing. These drug circuits are so deeply embedded. Don't think it's a cakewalk to that one day we take a decision and we tell the international community, the United Nations passes a resolution and all the nations come together to fight drugs. No, it doesn't happen that way. It doesn't work that way. Right? There are different nations with different interests. They will play it differently. India till today has not been able to get its resolution on terrorism passed in the United Nations. United Nations has till today not given a definition of the term terrorism. Right? So it's not easy getting these kind of things done in international relations. Although everyone, on the face of it, everyone knows this is the solution. Cut out the money. The Taliban will bleed to death. Terrorists will bleed to death. But it doesn't work that way. Right? So while your idea is, on the face of it, is absolutely correct, it's a question of the practical applicability which is in question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I think we have a question in the chat box. Meher Fatima, could you please ask your question?
What's the question in the chat box? From Meher Fatma. Okay.
So, will Taliban's rise vilify for legitimacy prove to be the litmus test for statistics? As Taliban is a non-state actor, its rise will encourage other groups to have similar aspirations.
Well, that's an interesting question. Let me see the second question also, if I can combine. Since the vacation of US troops in Afghanistan, Taliban has got a boost to rock and roll. So, sir, we see Taliban has also got religious linkage with neighbors like Pakistan. So, will we stand of India to counter it when it comes to Kashmir? I think I've answered that question largely. So, let me talk about the aspect of it being a non-state actor. The Taliban is slowly progressing to become a state actor, virtually. Because, of course, as long as the government of national unity is there, as long as they are holding the Afghan flag, they are the state authority, and therefore everyone else is non-state who is fighting against them. But this is a tenuous situation. And I do agree with you that, yes, a lot of non-state actors do get encouraged by the success of other non-state actors. Now, we've not had too much of such success. The ISIS has failed, for example. The Al-Qaeda has failed. Major groups have all failed. The Taliban is not a terror group in the classic definition of that term. It is limited by geography, right? It's limited by geography. It is not networked internationally. And I don't think it has got international ambitions of that kind, at least not declared ambitions of that kind anyway. But despite that, I agree with you that a success of a non-state group such as this will give definitely an encouragement to many others. And that's exactly what I was alluding to when I spoke about Jammu and Kashmir. That separatist Pakistani-sponsored groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, etc. And in Pakistan, groups such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, all the anti-Shia groups, these are the ones which will definitely receive an impetus as far as that's why we say that Pakistan is going to have major problems. Internal security-wise, Pakistan is the one which is going to have major problems. And when Pakistan has internal security problems, you'll find the valve opens out to do something on the line of control. And that's something which we have to be always careful about. Yeah. So I think that's the last of it.
Yes, we have had a lot of questions, and I think I would like to thank you on behalf of the Athar for this very insightful session. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, and it's always very engaging. No one feels sleepy and all the things. It's always lively with you. So I would like to once again thank you for joining us on this webinar.
Thank you very much.